The moment the medicine passed Eleanor Everett's lips, her throat began to close. It was as if someone had tied a silk scarf around her neck and was slowly tightening it with each labored breath she took. Her blue eyes widened in panic as she clutched at her throat, the small bottle of tonic falling from her trembling fingers to the wooden floor of Marfa's only doctor's office. "I can't breathe," she gasped, watching the horror spread across Dr. Wilson's weathered face. "Good Lord," he whispered, reaching for her pulse as her knees buckled beneath her. "Miss Everett is having a reaction to the tonic." Spring of 1878 had brought more than just wildflowers to the dusty Texas town. It had brought Eleanor Everett, 22 years old and fresh from finishing school in Boston, to stay with her uncle who had established himself as a successful merchant in the frontier town of Marfa. What was meant to be a summer visit to recover from a lingering cough had turned potentially deadly in an instant. Eleanor could feel her consciousness slipping as Dr. Wilson's assistant helped move her to the examination table. The world was growing dim around the edges, sounds becoming muffled as if she were underwater. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Dr. Wilson's panicked voice. "We need a different medicine. The one from Dr. Taylor in Alpine, it's her only hope. Someone ride for it now." Miles Davis had just finished loading supplies into his wagon when the commotion erupted from the doctor's office across the street. At 30, he'd spent more than half his life in the saddle, working cattle drives across Texas, before settling in Marfa 3 years ago to establish his modest ranch. The hard lines of his sun-weathered face and the calloused hands spoke of years of honest work, while the quiet confidence in his hazel eyes had earned him respect from most men in town. "Davis," Sheriff Jenkins called, rushing from the doctor's office. "We need your help. Miss Everett's having a bad reaction to medicine. Doc Wilson says she needs a special remedy from Alpine and fast." Miles didn't hesitate. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Doc says she might not make it through the night without it." That was all Miles needed to hear. He'd seen Eleanor Everett in town several times since her arrival 2 weeks prior. Unlike some of the other cowboys who made fools of themselves trying to impress the refined Eastern lady, Miles had kept his distance. Not because he wasn't struck by her beauty with her auburn hair and graceful manner. She'd caught his eye immediately, but because a man like him had no business courting a lady of her standing. "I'll go," Miles said, already striding toward the livery stable where his stallion, Thunder, was kept. "What am I asking for? Dr. Taylor's special anti-inflammatory tincture, he'll know what it is. Doc Wilson says to hurry." Alpine was nearly 30 miles away through rough country. With night approaching and storm clouds gathering on the horizon, it would be a dangerous ride. But Miles knew these trails better than most, and Thunder was the strongest horse in the county. Within minutes, he had saddled Thunder and was galloping out of town, the urgency of his mission driving him forward. As Marfa disappeared behind him, Miles settled into the rhythm of hard riding, his mind focused on the task ahead. Inside the doctor's office, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness. Her skin had broken out in angry red welts, and her breathing came in shallow, wheezing gasps. Dr. Wilson applied cool compresses to her forehead and neck, doing what little he could to ease her suffering. "Hold on, Miss Everett," he murmured. "Help is coming." Eleanor's uncle, Howard Everett, paced the small waiting room, his normally imposing businessman demeanor crumbled by fear. "Will she make it, doctor? Should we prepare for the worst?" Dr. Wilson met the older man's gaze steadily. "Miles Davis is our best horseman. If anyone can make it to Alpine and back in time, it's him. The rancher. I've barely exchanged words with the man." "That may be so, but he's riding for your niece's life right now. And I've never known Miles Davis to fail when someone's counting on him." The storm Miles had spotted on the horizon caught up with him just as darkness fell. Rain slashed sideways, driven by a fierce wind that cut through his duster like it was made of paper. Thunder pushed on valiantly, but the trail was quickly turning to mud, forcing Miles to slow their pace. "Come on, boy," he encouraged, leaning forward in the saddle. "We've got to keep moving." A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that spooked Thunder. The horse reared, nearly unseating Miles, who managed to hang on through years of experience. "Easy," he commanded, bringing the horse back under control. "Easy now." Miles calculated the distance in his head. They were perhaps halfway to Alpine, but at this rate, it would be well past midnight before they arrived. And then there was the return journey to consider. Every minute counted, and somewhere back in Marfa, Eleanor Everett was fighting for her life. The thought of her face, pale and suffering, spurred him onward. Though they'd never spoken more than passing pleasantries, there was something about her that had stayed with him, a quiet dignity, perhaps, or the way her smile transformed her entire face when she greeted the town children. Whatever it was, Miles knew he couldn't fail her now. The rain continued unabated for another hour before finally easing to a drizzle. The trail was treacherous, but Miles pressed on, navigating by instinct and the occasional glimpse of stars between the breaking clouds. Thunder was tiring, but the stallion seemed to sense the importance of their mission and responded to Miles's gentle urgings with renewed effort. By the time they reached Alpine, it was just past midnight. The town was dark except for a few lanterns glowing in windows. Miles headed straight for Dr. Taylor's house, which stood at the end of the main street. He pounded on the door, not caring about the late hour. "Dr. Taylor, it's an emergency." After a moment, a light appeared in the window, and soon the door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, hastily pulling on a robe. "What's the meaning of this?" "Dr. Wilson from Marfa sent me. A woman, Miss Everett, had a reaction to a medicine. He says she needs your special anti-inflammatory tincture and fast." Recognition dawned in Dr. Taylor's eyes. "Come in, quickly." Miles followed the doctor inside, explaining Eleanor's symptoms as Dr. Wilson had described them. Dr. Taylor nodded gravely as he moved around his office, gathering bottles and measuring ingredients. "This is serious indeed. I've seen such reactions before. The tincture will help, but she'll need careful attention for several days afterward." He handed Miles a small wooden box containing 3 bottles. "The instructions are inside. Tell Wilson to follow them precisely." "I will, thank you, Doctor. You're riding back tonight, Doctor?" Taylor asked incredulously, noting Miles's exhausted appearance. "I have to. Doc Wilson said she might not make it through the night." The older man nodded solemnly. "Then Godspeed, young man. That girl's life is in your hands." Those words echoed in Miles's mind as he mounted Thunder once more. The horse was tired, but after a brief rest and some water, he seemed ready for the return journey. Miles patted his neck gratefully. "Just a few more hours, boy. Someone's counting on us." The ride back was even more challenging. The storm had passed, but it had left the trails muddy and treacherous. Several times, Thunder nearly lost his footing on slippery slopes. Miles's body ached with fatigue, but he pushed aside his discomfort, focusing instead on the precious cargo in his saddlebag and the young woman waiting for it in Marfa. Dawn was breaking as Miles finally spotted the familiar outline of Marfa in the distance. Thunder, sensing the end of their journey, found a last reserve of energy and picked up his pace. Miles rode straight to the doctor's office, where a lamp still burned in the window despite the early hour. He dismounted stiffly, his legs nearly buckling beneath him after so many hours in the saddle. Taking the wooden box from his saddlebag, he hurried to the door and knocked urgently. Dr. Wilson himself answered, his face haggard from a sleepless night. His expression transformed to relief when he saw Miles. "You made it, thank God." Miles handed him the box. "Doctor Taylor said to follow the instructions exactly." "How is she?" Dr. Wilson's face grew somber. "She's holding on, but only just. Come in, your timing couldn't be better." Miles followed the doctor inside, removing his mud-splattered hat. The waiting room was empty except for Howard Everett, who had fallen asleep in a chair. The merchant awoke with a start as they entered. "You got the medicine?" he asked, hope and fear mingling in his voice. "Yes, sir," Miles replied. "Dr. Taylor sent everything needed." "Bless you, Davis. I won't forget this." Dr. Wilson was already opening the box, reading the instructions carefully. "I need to prepare this right away. Miles, would you mind staying? I might need an extra pair of hands." Though exhausted, Miles nodded. "Of course." While Dr. Wilson worked with the medicine, Miles sat heavily in a chair, his body finally registering the toll of the night's ride. Every muscle protested, and his eyes burned with fatigue. But sleep was the furthest thing from his mind as he listened to Eleanor's labored breathing from the next room. After what seemed an eternity, Dr. Wilson emerged with a small cup containing a dark liquid. "It's ready. Now we pray it works." Miles and Howard followed him into the examination room where Eleanor lay. Miles's heart clenched at the sight of her. Her face was swollen, her breathing shallow and irregular. She looked nothing like the vibrant young woman he'd observed from a distance, laughing with the shopkeeper's children or selecting ribbons at the general store. Dr. Wilson gently raised her head. "Miss Everett, can you hear me? I need you to drink this medicine." Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, but she didn't seem fully conscious. The doctor carefully tipped the cup against her lips, ensuring she swallowed the liquid in small sips. When the cup was empty, he laid her head back on the pillow and checked her pulse. "Now we wait," he said quietly. "The next few hours will tell us if we were in time." Howard pulled up a chair beside his niece, taking her hand in his. "I'll stay with her." Dr. Wilson nodded. "I'll be right outside if you need me." He turned to Miles. "You should get some rest, Davis. You've done more than enough." Miles knew he should leave, should see to Thunder and then find his own bed, but something kept him rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from Eleanor's face. "I'd like to stay a while, if that's all right," he said finally, "just to make sure the medicine works." Dr. Wilson gave him a knowing look, but didn't comment. Instead, he simply nodded and left the room. Miles found a chair in the corner and sat down, his body grateful for the respite. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him as he watched the subtle rise and fall of Eleanor's chest, willing each breath to come easier than the last. As the morning progressed, a remarkable change began to occur. The angry red welts on Eleanor's skin started to fade, and her breathing grew steadier, deeper. By mid-morning, the swelling in her face had noticeably decreased. Dr. Wilson, who checked on her regularly, couldn't hide his relief. "The medicine is working," he declared after one such examination. "Her pulse is stronger and her airways are clearing. Miles, you got here just in time." It was nearly noon when Eleanor finally opened her eyes fully. She looked disoriented at first, her gaze wandering around the unfamiliar room until it settled on her uncle, Uncle Howard. Her voice was barely a whisper, her throat still raw from the reaction. "Eleanor, thank God." Howard squeezed her hand gently. "You gave us quite a scare, my dear." "What happened?" she asked, trying to piece together her fragmented memories. Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "You had a severe allergic reaction to the tonic I gave you yesterday. It nearly." He couldn't finish the sentence. Let's just say we're very fortunate that Mr. Davis here was willing to make a dangerous night ride to Alpine to fetch the medicine that saved you. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Miles, who still sat in the corner, hat in hands. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. Miles felt something stir within him, a connection he couldn't explain. "You rode to Alpine during the storm?" Eleanor asked, her voice gaining a little strength. Miles shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "It needed doing, madam. Anyone would have done the same." A small smile touched her lips. "I doubt that very much, Mr. Davis. Thank you for saving my life." The simple sincerity in her words caught him off guard. Miles nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. He was saved from having to reply when Dr. Wilson stepped in. "Miss Everett needs rest now. The medicine will continue to work, but her body has been through a tremendous ordeal. I'd like to keep her here today for observation, but if all goes well, she can return to your home tomorrow, Mr. Everett." Howard nodded. "Whatever you think best, doctor. I'll make arrangements." Miles took this as his cue to leave. Rising from his chair, he placed his hat on his head. "I should see to my horse. He had a hard night, too." "Of course," Dr. Wilson said. "What you did was remarkable, Miles. The whole town will hear of it." Miles grimaced slightly. The last thing he wanted was attention. "That's not necessary, Doc. I'm just glad Miss Everett is on the mend." He glanced at Eleanor once more. "Madam, I wish you a speedy recovery." "Mr. Davis," she called softly as he turned to leave, "I hope I'll have the chance to thank you properly when I'm well." There was something in her eyes, a warmth, an interest that made Miles's heart beat a little faster. "No thanks needed, Miss Everett. Good day to you all." As Miles finally stepped into the sunshine, exhaustion hit him full force. Thunder was where he'd left him, being tended to by the doctor's son who had given the horse water and a brush down. Miles thanked the boy and led Thunder toward the livery stable, his thoughts still on the woman whose life he'd helped save. Little did he know that this night ride was just the beginning of their story. 3 days later, Eleanor sat on the porch of her uncle's house, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm afternoon. Her strength was returning gradually, but Dr. Wilson had advised her to take plenty of rest and fresh air. The allergic reaction had taken a greater toll on her body than she'd initially realized. She was watching the street thoughtfully when her uncle joined her, carrying a glass of lemonade. "How are you feeling today, Eleanor?" he asked, handing her the drink. "Much better, thank you." She took a sip, enjoying the tart sweetness. "Dr. Wilson says I'm making excellent progress." Howard nodded, settling into the chair beside her. "He mentioned you should avoid any medicines with similar ingredients in the future. He's making a list for you to carry." "A wise precaution," Eleanor agreed. Her gaze drifted down the street again, searching for a particular figure. She hadn't seen Miles Davis since that morning in the doctor's office, though she'd thought of him often. Howard followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. Looking for someone in particular, Eleanor felt a blush warm her cheeks. "I never properly thanked Mr. Davis for what he did. It seems rather important, don't you think?" "Indeed it does," Howard replied, his tone thoughtful. "Davis is a good man, one of the most respected in these parts, despite his modest circumstances. He started with nothing and built his ranch through hard work and determination." This piqued Eleanor's interest. In Boston, a man's worth was often measured by his family name and inheritance rather than his own merits. "Tell me more about him." Howard leaned back in his chair. "Came here about 3 years ago with just his horse and the clothes on his back. Worked for various ranches until he saved enough to buy a small parcel of land south of town. Now he has a decent spread and a growing herd. Keeps to himself mostly, but always helps when someone's in need. What he did for you riding through that storm all night, that's just the kind of man he is." Eleanor considered this information carefully, and yet he hasn't come to see how I'm faring. "He's not one to seek attention or thanks," Howard said. "But as it happens, I invited him to dinner tomorrow evening. I hope you don't mind." Eleanor couldn't hide her smile. "Not at all. I think that's a wonderful idea." The following evening found Eleanor spending more time than usual on her appearance. She chose her green dress, the one that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the color of her eyes. As she pinned her hair up, leaving a few curls to frame her face, she wondered why she felt so nervous about seeing Miles Davis again. Perhaps it was simply the unusual circumstances of their acquaintance. After all, it wasn't every day that a stranger risked his life to save hers. Or perhaps it was the memory of his steady gaze meeting hers in the doctor's office, a gaze that had stayed with her in the days since. When she heard the knock at the front door, Eleanor took a deep breath to calm her fluttering nerves. She listened as Maria, her uncle's housekeeper, greeted their guest and led him to the parlor. Giving herself one final glance in the mirror, Eleanor made her way downstairs. Miles stood as she entered the room, and Eleanor was struck by the transformation. Gone was the mud-splattered cowboy from the doctor's office. In his place stood a man in clean, pressed clothes, his dark hair neatly combed, though still a bit too long by Eastern standards. He appeared somewhat uncomfortable in these more formal circumstances, but there was an undeniable dignity about him that transcended his rough frontier background. "Miss Everett," he said, nodding politely. "It's good to see you looking so well." "Thanks to you, Mr. Davis," she replied with a warm smile. "Please sit down." As they settled into chairs, Howard joined them, offering Miles a glass of whiskey which he accepted with thanks. "I was just telling Eleanor about your ranch yesterday," Howard said. "How many head of cattle are you running now?" "About 200, Miles replied. "Nothing compared to the big spreads, but it's growing. I'm hoping to add another 50 by year's end." "Impressive progress for just 3 years," Howard remarked. Miles shrugged modestly. "I've been fortunate. The land is good, and I had some experience from working other ranches." Throughout dinner, Eleanor found herself increasingly intrigued by Miles Davis. Unlike many men she'd met, he spoke directly and honestly, without pretense or exaggeration. When asked about his midnight ride to Alpine, he downplayed the danger and difficulty, focusing instead on his horse's performance and the kindness of Dr. Taylor. "You're being far too modest," Eleanor said at last. "Dr. Wilson told me how treacherous the trail becomes in the rain, especially at night. What you did was extraordinary, Mr. Davis, and I owe you my life." Miles looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she persisted gently. "You did. And I'd very much like to see this remarkable horse of yours someday thunder. Isn't that his name? He deserves my thanks as well." A genuine smile transformed Miles's face, softening the weathered lines around his eyes. "He'd appreciate that, Miss Everett. He's rather fond of attention, unlike his owner." The evening passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Eleanor had anticipated. By the time Miles rose to leave, she felt as if she'd glimpsed something essential about him, an integrity and quiet strength that intrigued her deeply. "Perhaps, if you're feeling up to it," Miles said hesitantly at the door, "you might like to visit the ranch sometime. It's not much to look at compared to what you're used to in Boston, but the view from the ridge is something special." "I'd like that very much," Eleanor replied, surprised and pleased by the invitation. "I could bring the buggy around on Sunday afternoon if that suits." He glanced at Howard, including him in the invitation. "An excellent idea," Howard said, "though I'm afraid I have business to attend to." Perhaps Eleanor's companion, Mrs. Finch, could accompany her. And so it was arranged. As Miles tipped his hat in farewell, Eleanor felt a strange anticipation building within her, an eagerness for Sunday that had little to do with seeing the ranch, and everything to do with spending more time with the man who had saved her life. Sunday dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze tempering the Texas heat. Eleanor dressed carefully in a practical blue skirt and white blouse, with a wide-brimmed hat to shield her fair skin from the sun. Mrs. Finch, a widow in her 50s who had accompanied Eleanor from Boston as a chaperone and companion, fussed around her with last-minute adjustments. "Remember to keep your parasol up, dear," Mrs. Finch advised. "The western sun is much stronger than what you're accustomed to." Eleanor accepted the parasol dutifully, though she was more concerned with the butterflies in her stomach than with potential sunburn. She had never felt this way about a man before, certainly not about any of the eligible bachelors her parents had paraded before her in Boston drawing rooms. Miles arrived precisely at the agreed-upon time, driving a well-maintained buggy pulled by a bay mare. He helped both women up with a strong, sure hand, then climbed up himself and set the horse in motion. "It's about 5 miles to my place," he explained as they left the town behind. "Not a long journey, but I thought Miss Everett might enjoy seeing a bit more of the countryside." "Indeed I would," Eleanor replied warmly. "I've hardly ventured beyond Marfa since my arrival." As they traveled, Miles pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about the area. Eleanor was struck by how the harsh landscape had shaped him, how he spoke of drought and flash floods, predators and cattle thieves with the same calm acceptance. This was a man who understood the realities of frontier life and faced them squarely. The Davis Ranch itself was modest, but well-maintained. A small, sturdy house stood near a barn and corral, with several outbuildings nearby. What caught Eleanor's eye, however, was the breathtaking view beyond rolling hills stretching toward distant mountains, the landscape painted in shades of ochre, rust, and sage. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely as Miles helped her down from the buggy. "This is what sold me on the property," he admitted. "The land isn't the most fertile, but that view—" He shook his head, words failing him. "I understand completely." After showing them around the main buildings, Miles led them to the corral where a magnificent black stallion watched them approach with intelligent eyes. "This is Thunder," Miles said, a note of pride in his voice. "The best horse I've ever had the privilege of riding." Eleanor approached the fence and the stallion came closer, curious about the visitors. "Hello, Thunder," she said softly. "I understand I owe you my life as well." The horse snorted and tossed his head as if acknowledging the praise. "He likes you," Miles observed with a smile. "He's usually more standoffish with strangers." "Animals have always been drawn to Eleanor," Mrs. Finch remarked. "Even as a child, she could charm the most ill-tempered cat into purring." Eleanor laughed. "Mrs. Finch exaggerates, but I do love animals." She reached out cautiously, and Thunder stretched his neck to sniff her hand. After a moment's consideration, he allowed her to stroke his velvety nose. Miles watched the interaction with evident pleasure. "Would you like to ride him?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." "He's your horse, and I'm not dressed for riding." "Not today, perhaps," Miles conceded. "But another time if you'd like. He's spirited but gentle when he trusts someone." The offer touched Eleanor deeply. For a man like Miles, his horse was more than just property, it was a partner and friend. That he would trust her with Thunder spoke volumes. "I'd be honored," she said softly. They continued their tour, with Miles showing them his small herd grazing in a nearby pasture and the spring that provided water for the ranch. Throughout, Eleanor was impressed by the thought and care that had gone into establishing the place. Miles might not have the wealth or social standing of her Boston acquaintances, but he had built something meaningful through his own efforts. As the afternoon waned, they settled on the porch with glasses of cool water and a plate of cookies that Mrs. Finch had insisted on bringing. The older woman, seeming to sense the growing connection between Eleanor and Miles, tactfully became absorbed in watching a family of quail making their way across the yard, giving the pair a measure of privacy. "How are you feeling now?" Miles asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "No lasting effects from the incident?" "None at all, thanks to you," Eleanor assured him. "Though Dr. Wilson has given me a detailed list of ingredients to avoid in the future. Apparently, I'm allergic to a particular type of herb that was in that tonic." Miles nodded solemnly. "Good. When I saw you in the doctor's office that morning." He paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. "Well, I'm just glad you're all right now." Eleanor studied his face, noting the emotion he was trying to conceal. "It must have been terrifying, riding through that storm, knowing someone's life depended on your speed." "I didn't think about it much at the time," he admitted. "Just focused on the task at hand. It's only afterwards that I realized how close." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't need to. On impulse, Eleanor reached over and placed her hand on his. "Thank you, Miles. Not just for the ride, but for staying until you knew I would recover. It meant a great deal to me." His hand turned beneath hers, his calloused palm against her smooth one. The simple contact sent a wave of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "I couldn't have done otherwise," he said simply, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Finch clearing her throat delicately. "I believe we should start back soon if we're to reach town before dinner," she suggested. Eleanor reluctantly withdrew her hand, though the memory of his touch lingered. "Yes, of course. Uncle Howard will be expecting us." The ride back to town was filled with comfortable conversation, punctuated by moments of companionable silence. As they approached the Everett house, Eleanor found herself wishing the journey had been longer. "Thank you for showing us your ranch," she said, as Miles helped her down from the buggy. "It was a lovely afternoon." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, his eyes conveying more than his words. "Perhaps you might join me again sometime. There's a valley to the west with wildflowers that should be blooming soon." "I'd like that very much." As Miles drove away, Mrs. Finch gave Eleanor a knowing look. "That young man is quite taken with you, my dear." Eleanor smiled, not bothering to deny it. "The feeling is mutual, Mrs. Finch." The older woman patted her hand affectionately. "Just be cautious, Eleanor. Your uncle may approve of Mr. Davis, but your parents might have different expectations for your future." The reminder of her parents' expectations cast a slight shadow over Eleanor's happiness. They had sent her to Marfa to recover her health, not to fall in love with a rancher. They expected her to return to Boston in the fall and make a suitable match with someone from their social circle. But as Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she couldn't bring herself to regret the growing feelings for Miles Davis. There was something genuine about him that she'd never found in the polished young men of Boston society. And when he looked at her, she felt truly seen for the first time in her life. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Miles spent increasingly more time together. He showed her the wildflower valley as promised, and they rode, she on a gentle mare he borrowed from a neighbor, to a crystal-clear creek where they picnicked under the shade of cottonwood trees. Always properly chaperoned by Mrs. Finch, of course, though the good woman often became conveniently absorbed in her knitting or bird watching during these outings. Eleanor discovered that beneath Miles's quiet exterior lay a sharp mind and unexpected depths. He was well-read despite his limited formal education, having taught himself from books during the lonely nights on cattle drives. He spoke thoughtfully on topics ranging from ranching techniques to poetry, revealing a contemplative nature that complemented her more animated personality. For his part, Miles found himself increasingly captivated by Eleanor's intelligence and spirit. She approached the frontier with curiosity rather than complaint, eager to learn about this new world so different from her sheltered upbringing. Her genuine interest in his life and work touched him deeply, as did her kindness toward everyone she met, regardless of their station. By mid-June, their mutual attraction was obvious to everyone in Marfa. Howard Everett observed the developing relationship with cautious approval. He respected Miles and believed him to be a man of character, but he also knew his brother Eleanor's father would have serious reservations about such a match. These concerns were far from Eleanor's mind one perfect afternoon, as she and Miles walked along the edge of town, Mrs. Finch following at a discreet distance. The conversation had turned to their childhoods, with Eleanor sharing stories of her privileged but constrained upbringing in Boston. "Sometimes I felt like a bird in a gilded cage," she confessed. "Everything provided for, but so many limitations on where I could go, what I could do, even what I could say." Miles listened attentively, trying to imagine the formal world she described. "And now, do you miss Boston?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I miss certain things, the libraries, the concerts, some dear friends, but I don't miss feeling constantly judged and confined by expectations. Here I feel—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Free." The simple declaration hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Miles stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Eleanor," he began, using her given name for the first time, "I know I'm not the sort of man your family would choose for you. I can't offer grand houses or social standing. But these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life." Eleanor's heart quickened. "They've been the happiest of mine as well." Emboldened by her response, Miles continued, "I don't want to presume, and I know it's too soon to speak of certain things. But I need you to know that my feelings for you are sincere and deep." "As are mine for you," she replied softly, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. He took her gloved hand in his, the gesture both protective and reverent. "Then may I hope that, in time, you might consider a future here with me?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Eleanor knew what the proper response should be: a gentle deflection, a reminder of their different backgrounds, perhaps even a mention of her eventual return to Boston. But looking into Miles's earnest face, she couldn't bring herself to say any of those things. "I would consider it," she said instead, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her heart. "In fact, I already have been." Joy illuminated Miles's features, transforming his usual reserved expression. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might kiss her, right there on the edge of town with Mrs. Finch looking on. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture of old-world courtesy that touched her deeply. "That's all I can ask for now," he said. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They turned to see a rider approaching at speed, dust billowing behind him. As he drew closer, Eleanor recognized Pete Jenkins, who worked at her uncle's store. "Mr. Davis," Pete called, reining in his horse. "Glad I found you, sir. There's trouble at your place. Johnson said to tell you some of your cattle broke through the fence on the north pasture. They're headed for Becker's cornfield." Miles's expression immediately shifted to concern. "How many?" "At least 20 head, he thought. He's trying to round them up, but he needs help." Miles nodded grimly. "I'll head there right away." He turned to Eleanor apologetically. "I'm sorry I have to go." "Of course," she assured him, Go quickly." He hesitated just a moment longer, his eyes conveying what he couldn't say in front of others, then mounted Pete's horse and rode off at a gallop, leaving Pete to walk back to town. As Eleanor and Mrs. Finch made their way back to her uncle's house, she found her thoughts dwelling on the conversation with Miles. He had all but declared his intentions, and she had encouraged him. It was a significant step, one that would have serious implications for her future. That evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, her uncle joined her with his usual glass of whiskey. "I saw Miles Davis riding out of town in quite a hurry today," Howard remarked casually. "Something about cattle getting loose." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "He had to leave rather abruptly." Howard nodded, studying his niece's face in the fading light. "You care for him a great deal, don't you?" Eleanor saw no point in denying it. "I do, Uncle, more than I ever expected to care for anyone. And he for you, I think." Howard sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. "He's a good man, Eleanor, one of the best I've known, but he's not what my parents would want for me," she finished for him. "No," Howard agreed frankly. "They have certain expectations." Eleanor sighed, turning her gaze back to the sunset. "I know, but should those expectations determine the course of my life, my happiness, that's not for me to say." Howard's tone was gentle. "But whatever you decide, you should know that your parents will be arriving in Marfa next week." Eleanor turned to him in surprise. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "I only received their telegram today. They're concerned about your health after the incident with the medicine, and they want to bring you home to Boston earlier than planned." The news hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She had known all along that her time in Marfa was limited, but she had thought she had months yet months to explore her feelings for Miles, to consider her options, to make decisions about her future. "I see," she said at last, her voice small. "Then I suppose I have much to think about in the coming days." Howard reached over to pat her hand affectionately. "For what it's worth, Eleanor, I believe that true happiness is worth fighting for, wherever you may find it." His words stayed with her as she retired to her room that night. The arrival of her parents would force decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear to Eleanor: the thought of returning to Boston and never seeing Miles again was simply unbearable. Miles didn't return to town until late the following day, having spent the night helping to round up his scattered cattle and repair the damaged fence. He was exhausted and covered in dust, but his first thought was to check if Eleanor was at her uncle's store. He found her there, helping to arrange a display of fabric. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made his fatigue instantly worthwhile. "Miles, are your cattle safe?" "All accounted for," he confirmed, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance. "I apologize for how I look. I came straight from the ranch. No apology necessary." Her smile turned teasing. "Though I must say Thunder would be disappointed to see his master so untidy." Miles laughed, relaxing a bit. "He's seen worse, believe me." He hesitated, aware of the other customers in the store. "I was wondering if you might join me for a ride tomorrow afternoon. There's something I'd like to show you." Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. "I'd love to, but I should tell you my parents are arriving from Boston next week. They plan to take me back with them." The news hit Miles hard, though he tried not to let it show. "I see. All the more reason for us to make the most of the time we have then." "Yes," she agreed, her eyes conveying what couldn't be said aloud in the public setting. "Tomorrow afternoon would be perfect." As Miles left the store, his mind raced with implications. He had known from the beginning that Eleanor's stay in Marfa was temporary, but the reality of her departure was now imminent. The thought of her leaving, of never seeing her again, was like a physical pain in his chest. By the time they met the following afternoon, Miles had made a decision. He had spent the morning preparing, cleaning himself up properly and ensuring that Thunder was groomed to perfection. Mrs. Finch, as usual, accompanied them, riding in a small buggy behind their horses. Miles led Eleanor to a spot he'd discovered years ago, a small mesa, overlooking a valley where a natural spring created an oasis of green amid the arid landscape. They tied their horses to a juniper tree and walked to the edge, where a flat rock provided a natural seat. "This is breathtaking," Eleanor said, taking in the panoramic view. "How did you find it?" "I was tracking a mountain lion that had been taking calves," Miles explained. "Never did find the cat, but I found this place instead. I come here sometimes when I need to think." Eleanor sensed there was more to this visit than just sharing a beautiful view. "And what are you thinking about today, Miles?" He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "About you, about us." Eleanor's heart began to race. "My parents' arrival doesn't change how I feel about you," she said quickly. "I'm glad to hear that." Miles took her hands in his expression intense. "Eleanor, I know this is sudden, and I know there are 1,000 reasons why you might say no. But I can't bear the thought of you leaving without knowing." He paused, seemingly struggling for words. "Knowing what?" she prompted gently. "That I love you," he said simply. "That I've loved you since the moment you opened your eyes in the doctor's office and looked at me as if I were worth something. And that, if you could see your way to staying in Marfa, to becoming my wife, I would spend every day of my life trying to make you happy." Eleanor's breath caught at the unexpected proposal. She had known they were moving toward something serious, but she hadn't anticipated this, not so soon, not with her parents' arrival looming. "Miles," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I love you too. More than I thought possible in such a short time. But my parents will object," he finished for her. "I know that. I'm not asking you to defy them outright, but I am asking you to consider a future here with me instead of returning to Boston. To give us a chance to show them that what we have is real and lasting." Eleanor looked out over the valley, her mind racing. What Miles was proposing would mean going against her parents' wishes, possibly even facing their disapproval or anger. It would mean choosing a life vastly different from what she had been raised to expect, a life of hard work and simple pleasures, rather than luxury and social standing. And yet, when she imagined returning to Boston to the stifling social expectations, the superficial relationships, the carefully arranged marriage to some suitable gentleman who would never look at her the way Miles did now, she felt only emptiness. "It won't be easy," she said at last, turning back to meet his gaze. "My parents have certain expectations. They may not understand or approve, at least not at first." Hope kindled in Miles's eyes. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying yes," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I'll stay in Marfa. Yes, I'll be your wife, if you'll have me despite the complications I bring." The joy that transformed Miles's face was answer enough, but he confirmed it with words. "I'd face 1,000 complications to have you by my side, Eleanor Everett." He drew her into his arms then, and their lips met in a first kiss that was tender and reverent, yet filled with promise. When they finally parted, Eleanor felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her, as if pieces of her life that had never quite fit had suddenly fallen into place. From her discreet position near the buggy, Mrs. Finch observed the kiss and quickly averted her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. She had grown fond of Miles Davis and believed him to be exactly the kind of steady, honorable man Eleanor needed. The coming days would be difficult, with the Everett's arrival likely to bring conflict, but Mrs. Finch resolved to support the young couple however she could. As Miles and Eleanor rode back to town, Their conversation turned to practical matters: when to speak to her uncle, how to approach her parents, what arguments might sway them. But beneath these discussions ran a current of joy and certainty that sustained them both. "Whatever happens," Miles said as they neared Marfa, "know that I'll wait for you if need be. Whether it takes weeks or months to convince your parents, my feelings won't change." Eleanor reached across to touch his hand. "Nor will mine, but I hope it won't come to that. Once they meet you, once they see what kind of man you are." Miles wasn't as optimistic, but he kept his doubts to himself. For now, it was enough to know that Eleanor had chosen him, chosen the life they could build together. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, they would face them together. The Everetts arrived in Marfa the following Tuesday on the afternoon train from El Paso. Eleanor, her uncle, and Mrs. Finch were waiting at the station when they stepped onto the platform, her father distinguished and imposing in his tailored suit, her mother elegant despite the dust of travel. "Eleanor, darling," Catherine Everett embraced her daughter warmly. "Let me look at you." "You seem well. Has the Texas air been beneficial?" "Very much so, mother," Eleanor replied, returning the embrace. "I've never felt better." Edward Everett shook his brother's hand firmly. "Howard, good to see you. I trust you've been taking good care of our girl." "Of course," Howard assured him. "Though she hardly needed my care. Eleanor has adapted remarkably well to frontier life." Edward raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Has she indeed? Well, we'll soon have her back in civilization." Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Finch, who gave her an encouraging nod. The conversation she dreaded was coming, but not here, not now. First, her parents needed to settle in and rest from their journey. Howard had arranged for the Everetts to stay in the town's small hotel, as his house wasn't large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably. After seeing them settled and agreeing to meet for dinner, Eleanor returned to her uncle's house to prepare for the evening ahead. "Will Miles be joining us?" Mrs. Finch asked as she helped Eleanor dress. "No," Eleanor sighed. "I thought it best to speak with my parents privately first, to prepare them for the idea before introducing Miles. Uncle Howard agrees it's the wisest approach." Mrs. Finch nodded approvingly. "A sensible decision. Your mother, in particular, may need time to adjust to the notion." Dinner that evening was a pleasant affair on the surface, with Howard hosting his brother's family at the town's best restaurant. The conversation flowed easily as they caught up on family news and Boston gossip. But Eleanor could sense her father's impatience to discuss their real purpose bringing her home. Finally, as dessert was served, Edward Everett cleared his throat. "Now then, Eleanor, we should discuss our travel arrangements. I've booked passage on the eastbound train for Friday morning." "That should give you ample time to pack your things." Eleanor set down her fork, her heart pounding. "Actually, Father, I wanted to speak with you and Mother about that. I've been giving my future a great deal of thought during my time here." Catherine Everett's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean, dear?" "I mean that I've decided not to return to Boston, at least not permanently." Eleanor took a deep breath, then continued with as much composure as she could muster. "I've fallen in love with Marfa, with the openness of the land and the honesty of the people. And I've fallen in love with a man here, a good, honorable man who has asked me to be his wife." The stunned silence that followed her announcement was exactly what Eleanor had expected. Her father recovered first, his expression darkening. "This is absurd," he declared flatly. "You've been here barely 2 months. Whatever infatuation you may feel for some local fellow, it's not an infatuation," Eleanor interrupted, something she would never have dared do before her time in Texas. "His name is Miles Davis. He owns a ranch outside of town. And he saved my life when I had the allergic reaction to the medicine." Catherine Everett turned to Mrs. Finch accusingly. You were supposed to be chaperoning her. How could you allow this to happen? Mr. Davis has been a perfect gentleman throughout, Mrs. Finch replied calmly. And I have chaperoned every meeting. Their attachment has developed naturally and honorably. Edward Everett dismissed this with a wave of his hand. Be that as it may, Eleanor is returning to Boston with us. This frontier romance is simply out of the question. Eleanor had anticipated this reaction, but it still stung. Father, I'm 22 years old. I'm not asking for your permission, though I would very much prefer to have your blessing. You can't possibly be serious about staying here, her mother interjected, genuine distress in her voice. What kind of life would you have? Marfa is hardly Boston. A different life, certainly, Eleanor acknowledged, but one filled with purpose and meaning and love. Miles may not be wealthy by Boston standards, but he's building something real with his own hands. I admire that more than I can say. Howard, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Edward, Catherine, I've gotten to know Miles Davis well these past months. He's respected throughout the county for his integrity and work ethic. I wouldn't support this match if I didn't believe he would make Eleanor happy. Edward turned to his brother incredulously. You approve of this? Our daughter married to a cowboy, a rancher, Howard corrected mildly. And yes, I do approve. Miles is the kind of man who would walk through fire for those he loves. He's already proven that by riding through a storm all night to save Eleanor's life. This reminder seemed to give Edward pause, though his expression remained skeptical. Catherine, however, was still visibly upset. But darling, she appealed to Eleanor, what about your life in Boston? Your friends, the social season, the opportunities for a suitable match. We had such hopes. I know, Mother, Eleanor said gently. And I'm grateful for everything you and Father have done for me, but my happiness lies here now with Miles. This is too sudden, Edward declared, rising from his chair. You've been caught up in the romance of the frontier, Eleanor, and in gratitude to this man for his timely assistance. But marriage is a lifelong commitment, not a hasty decision made in the heat of emotion. I agree that it seems sudden, Eleanor conceded. That's why Miles and I aren't planning to marry immediately. We're willing to wait, to give you time to get to know him, to see that his character is everything I've described. This compromise seemed to take some of the wind from Edward's sails. He glanced at his wife, who gave a slight nod. Very well, he said at last. We'll extend our stay in Marfa for a week, no more, and we'll meet this Miles Davis of yours, but I make no promises, Eleanor. If at the end of the week your mother and I still believe this is a mistake, we expect you to return to Boston with us as planned. It wasn't the acceptance Eleanor had hoped for, but it was a start. Thank you, Father. That's all I ask, that you give him a fair chance. As the evening came to a close, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The first hurdle had been cleared, but the real challenge lay ahead. Somehow, she had to help her parents see Miles as she did not as a rough frontier figure beneath their daughter's station, but as the extraordinary man who had captured her heart. The following morning, Eleanor rode out to Miles's ranch to tell him of her conversation with her parents. She found him mending a fence, his shirt damp with honest labor despite the early hour. Eleanor. His face lit up at the sight of her, then quickly sobered as he noted her expression. You've spoken with your parents, she nodded, dismounting from her horse. They've agreed to meet you and to stay in Marfa for a week before making any decisions about my return to Boston. Miles wiped his brow with a bandana, considering this news. That's something, at least. When would they like to meet? I thought perhaps dinner at Uncle Howard's tomorrow night. Mrs. Finch is already planning the menu. Dinner, Miles repeated, a hint of trepidation in his voice. I'll need to dig out my good shirt. Eleanor laughed despite her nervousness. Just be yourself, Miles. That's all I want them to see, the man I fell in love with." He pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his dusty clothes. "And what if that's not enough for them?" "It will be," she insisted, though a flicker of doubt shadowed her eyes. "It has to be." The dinner at Howard Everett's house the following evening was a study in contrasts. Edward and Catherine Everett, impeccably dressed in the latest Boston fashion, seemed almost out of place in the frontier setting. Miles arrived punctually, wearing what was clearly his best suit, well made but simpler than Edward's tailored attire. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face cleanly shaved, his manner respectful but not subservient. Eleanor introduced him to her parents with as much composure as she could muster. "Mother, father, this is Miles Davis." Miles shook Edward's hand firmly. "Mr. Everett, Mrs. Everett. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Eleanor has spoken of you often and with great affection." Catherine offered a cool nod, her assessment of the young rancher evident in her expression. "Mr. Davis, we understand we have you to thank for our daughter's recovery from her recent illness." "I only did what anyone would have done," Miles replied modestly. "Your daughter's life is precious to many people in Marfa, myself included." The dinner that followed was a delicate dance of conversation and evaluation. Edward questioned Miles extensively about his ranch, his background, his plans for the future, questions that would have seemed intrusive in another context, but which Miles answered with straightforward honesty. Catherine observed more than she spoke, though her occasional remarks revealed her skepticism about frontier life. For her part, Eleanor watched the interactions with growing anxiety. Miles was acquitting himself well, she thought, but her father's expression remained inscrutable, and her mother's polite smile never quite reached her eyes. The moment of greatest tension came when Edward asked bluntly, "And what prospects can you offer my daughter, Mr. Davis? I understand ranching is a precarious business, subject to drought, disease, and fluctuating markets." Miles met the older man's gaze directly. "You're right, sir. Ranching has its risks, but I've built my operation carefully, with minimal debt and sufficient reserves to weather most setbacks. The land itself has value that will only increase as the territory develops, and while I can't offer Eleanor the luxuries she's accustomed to in Boston, I can promise her a comfortable home, my unwavering devotion, and a life of purpose." "Purpose?" Catherine echoed questioningly. "Yes, madam. Building something together, a home, a ranch, a future. It may seem simple compared to life in a great city, but there's meaning in it." Eleanor's heart swelled at Miles's words, which captured exactly what had drawn her to him and to the life he represented. She glanced at her parents, hoping to see some softening in their expressions, but found only continued reservation. As the evening drew to a close, Miles thanked Howard for his hospitality and bid a respectful farewell to the Everetts. "I hope we'll have the chance to speak again before you leave Marfa," he said to Edward. "Perhaps you'd care to visit my ranch, seeing it might give you a better understanding of what I'm offering Eleanor." Edward nodded, though without enthusiasm. "Perhaps. We'll see what our schedule allows." After Miles had gone, Eleanor faced her parents in the parlor, braced for their verdict. "Well," she asked simply. Catherine spoke first. "He seems a decent enough young man, Eleanor, well-spoken for someone of his background, but surely you can see that this is not the life we envisioned for you." "Your mother is right," Edward added. "Mr. Davis may be respectable by local standards, but you were raised for a different sphere. The novelty of frontier life might appeal to you now, but what of 5 years from now? 10? When you're isolated on a ranch miles from civilization, with none of the cultural and social advantages you've always enjoyed." Eleanor had anticipated these arguments. "I understand your concerns, But what good are social advantages if they don't bring happiness? In Boston, I always felt I was playing a role, the dutiful daughter, the accomplished young lady, forever meeting others' expectations. Here with Miles, I can simply be myself. And who is that? Catherine asked, more curious than confrontational. Who is the Eleanor who wants to be a rancher's wife? The question gave Eleanor pause. Someone stronger and more certain than I ever knew I could be. Someone who values directness over pretense, who finds beauty in open spaces rather than crowded ballrooms, who wants to build something real with her own hands rather than inherit something predetermined. Her parents exchanged glances, something shifting in their expressions. "You've changed," Edward observed, not unkindly. "I've grown," Eleanor corrected gently, "and found what I truly want rather than accepting what was expected of me." Catherine sighed, reaching for her daughter's hand. "We only want your happiness, Eleanor. We always have." "I know, Mother. That's why I'm asking you to trust me when I say that Miles makes me happier than I've ever been." The days that followed were filled with cautious negotiation. Edward did accept Miles's invitation to visit the ranch, spending a full afternoon inspecting the operation with a businessman's critical eye. To Eleanor's relief, he seemed genuinely impressed by Miles's efficient management and clear vision for the future. Catherine, meanwhile, spent more time with Eleanor, asking questions about her life in Marfa and, gradually, about her feelings for Miles. Though still concerned about the stark differences between Boston society and frontier life, she began to acknowledge the depth of her daughter's attachment. "He looks at you as if you hung the moon," Catherine remarked after observing Miles and Eleanor together at a small-town gathering. "I will say that much for him." "And I feel the same about him," Eleanor replied simply. On the final evening before the Everetts were to make their decision about returning to Boston, they gathered once more at Howard's house. Miles was present, at Eleanor's insistence, for this was the moment that would determine their future. Edward Everett, ever the patriarch, cleared his throat to signal he was ready to speak. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "Catherine and I have given this matter a great deal of thought," he began formally. "We came to Marfa fully intending to bring Eleanor home to Boston, believing that to be in her best interest. Our initial reaction to her announcement was one of concern and, yes, disappointment." Eleanor's hand found Miles's, gripping it tightly as her father continued. "However, we have observed both Mr. Davis and our daughter carefully this past week. We have seen the evident regard they hold for each other, and the respect Mr. Davis commands in this community. We have noted the improvement in Eleanor's health and spirits since her arrival in Marfa." He paused, his expression softening slightly as he looked at his daughter. "Most importantly, we have recognized that Eleanor is no longer a child to be directed, but a young woman capable of making her own choices, even when those choices differ from our expectations." Hope began to rise in Eleanor's heart as her father turned to Miles. "Mr. Davis, while your circumstances are more modest than we might have wished for our daughter, your character appears to be all that she has claimed. Should Eleanor choose to remain in Marfa as your wife, you will have our blessing conditional upon certain arrangements." "What arrangements would those be, sir?" Miles asked cautiously. "First, a proper engagement period of at least 6 months, to ensure that this attachment is as enduring as you both believe. Second, regular correspondence between Eleanor and her mother, with visits to Boston when possible. And third," Edward added with unexpected practicality, "the completion of the additional room on your house before the wedding. I've seen the construction you've begun, and I agree it will make a fine home, but not until it's finished." Miles nodded solemnly. "Those conditions are more than fair, Mr. Everett. I accept them gladly." Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Father, Mother, do you truly mean it? You're giving us your blessing." Catherine Everett rose and embraced her daughter. "Your happiness matters more to us than our own plans, dear. If Mr. Davis is truly the source of that happiness, then yes, you have our blessing." The relief and joy that flooded through Eleanor was overwhelming. She hugged her mother tightly, then her father, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." Edward turned to Miles, his expression still serious but no longer disapproving. "I trust you understand the treasure we're entrusting to your care, Mr. Davis." "I do, sir," Miles replied with equal gravity, "and I promise to cherish her every day of my life." The atmosphere in the room lightened noticeably after this exchange. Howard produced a bottle of his finest whiskey to toast the engagement, while Mrs. Finch dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, unabashedly sentimental about the happy resolution. Later that evening, as Miles prepared to leave, Eleanor walked with him to the porch, eager for a moment alone. "I can hardly believe it," she said, still dazed by the turn of events. "Just days ago, I was afraid they would insist on taking me back to Boston." Miles drew her into his arms, his expression one of profound gratitude. "Your father is a wiser man than I gave him credit for. He saw what matters most, your happiness." "Our happiness," Eleanor corrected, reaching up to touch his cheek tenderly. "6 months seems an eternity to wait." Miles smiled, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "It will give me time to finish the house properly, and to prove to your parents that their trust isn't misplaced." "You've already proven that to me," Eleanor whispered, rising on tiptoes to meet his lips in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. The months that followed were filled with purpose and anticipation. True to his word, Miles worked diligently on the house, adding not only the additional bedroom Edward had mentioned, but also expanding the parlor and building a covered porch where Eleanor could sit and enjoy the magnificent Texas sunsets. Eleanor, meanwhile, divided her time between helping at her uncle's store, learning the practical skills she would need as a rancher's wife, and preparing for her wedding. Her parents returned to Boston after ensuring that all arrangements were satisfactory, but they wrote regularly, gradually accepting and even embracing their daughter's unconventional choice. Catherine sent crates of household items, linens, dishes, books to help establish Eleanor's new home, while Edward surprised them with a substantial wedding gift of breeding stock to strengthen Miles's herd. The town of Marfa embraced the romance that had begun with a life-threatening crisis and evolved into one of their favorite love stories. Dr. Wilson often joked that he should be best man at the wedding, given his inadvertent role in bringing them together. "If I hadn't given you that medicine you were allergic to," he told Eleanor with a twinkle in his eye, "Miles might never have had the chance to play hero." "Then I suppose I should be grateful for my unfortunate reaction," Eleanor replied, laughing. "Though I could have done without the swollen throat and fear of imminent death." When the wedding day finally arrived exactly 6 months after the Everetts gave their blessing, it seemed all of Marfa and the surrounding ranches turned out for the celebration. Edward and Catherine returned from Boston for the occasion, bringing trunks of gifts and, more importantly, their wholehearted support. The ceremony was held in Marfa's small church, decorated with wildflowers gathered from the valley Miles had shown Eleanor during their courtship. She wore a gown of creamy satin sent from Boston but carried a bouquet of Texas bluebonnets, a fitting symbol of her bridged worlds. Miles, standing at the altar in a new suit, watched with wonder as Eleanor walked toward him on her father's arm. The journey that had begun with a midnight ride through a storm was culminating in this moment of perfect joy, and he silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought her into his life. As they exchanged vows, their voices strong and sure, Eleanor felt a deep certainty that she had found her true home not in Boston or even in Marfa itself, but with the man who had risked everything to save her life and had then captured her heart with his quiet strength and unwavering devotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and as Miles kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, food and laughter. Edward Everett, initially so opposed to the match, proposed a heartfelt toast to the newlyweds. "When we sent Eleanor to Marfa for her health, we never imagined she would find not only physical healing, but also the love of her life. Miles Davis may not have been the son-in-law we envisioned, but he has proven himself to be the one our daughter deserves. May your life together be as strong and enduring as the land you've chosen to call home." As the festivities wound down, Miles and Eleanor slipped away to begin their new life together. Their home, the ranch house Miles had worked so hard to complete, welcomed them with warmth and promise. Standing on the porch in the moonlight, Eleanor looked out over the land that had become so dear to her. "Are you happy, Mrs. Davis?" Miles asked softly, his arms encircling her waist. Eleanor turned in his embrace, her eyes shining with love. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible. And grateful every day for that terrible medicine that brought you galloping into my life." Miles laughed, drawing her closer. "I'd ride through 100 storms if it meant finding you at the end of the journey." "No need," Eleanor murmured against his lips. "The journey's just beginning, and we're on it together." 5 years later, Miles and Eleanor stood on that same porch, watching their 3-year-old son Matthew chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while their infant daughter Sarah slept peacefully in Eleanor's arms. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, growing from Miles's modest beginning into one of the most respected operations in the county. Eleanor's parents visited regularly, having gradually come to appreciate the beauty and dignity of the life their daughter had chosen. Edward Everett, to everyone's surprise, had developed a keen interest in cattle breeding and often spent his visits discussing ranch management with his son-in-law. Catherine, meanwhile, doted on her grandchildren and had become an unexpected advocate for frontier life among her Boston friends. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "That night when you rode through the storm for my medicine, did you ever dream that this would be our life?" Miles smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I didn't dare to hope. But I knew, from the moment you opened your eyes in that doctor's office, that I would do anything to be part of your life." "I'm glad you did," Eleanor said softly, looking out at the home and family they had built together. "That medicine nearly killed me, but in saving my life, you gave me everything worth living for." As the Texas sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Miles Davis and his wife stood together in the life they had chosen, a life born of crisis and courage, sustained by love and determination, and richer than either could have imagined on that fateful night when a cowboy rode through darkness to bring healing to the woman who would become his heart's true home.